On July 19, 1945, Commander Eugene Fluckey pressed his face against the periscope of the United States submarine Barb, hull number SS-220, and watched a train roll along the eastern coast of Karafuto. Karafuto was the Japanese name for the southern half of Sakhalin Island, a frozen slab of territory north of Hokkaido that Tokyo had incorporated as an inner land of the empire 2 years earlier, making it, by every legal and military definition Japan recognized, and part of the home islands. And Eugene Fluckey was watching it from less than a mile offshore, through 60 feet of cold green water, counting boxcars. He had been watching the trains for 3 days. Through the periscope, he could see the tracks of the Karafuto East Line running along the shoreline near a town called Otasamu, hugging the coast of Patience Bay. The trains came at predictable intervals, day and night, hauling freight and supplies along the coast in anticipation of an Allied invasion that Japanese commanders on the island believed was coming. Fluckey counted the cars. He noted the schedules. He watched the locomotive smoke rise against the grey Karafuto sky and disappear over the hills to the north. And somewhere in those 3 days of watching, Eugene Fluckey had an idea that no submarine commander in the history of naval warfare had ever had before. He was going to send his crew ashore, onto enemy soil, onto the home islands of the Empire of Japan, to destroy one of those trains. Not with a torpedo, not with a deck gun, not with the experimental rockets his submarine had already fired at Japanese towns along this same coast. He was going to put men into rubber boats, paddle them across 1,000 yards of open water in the dark, land them on a beach where Japanese sentries patrolled, march them 400 yards inland to a railroad track, plant a demolition charge under the rails, and bring them back alive before anyone on shore knew they had been there. It was, by any reasonable measure, insane. Submarines did not conduct ground operations. Submarine crews were not trained as commandos. The men who would carry out this mission were not Marines, not Army Rangers, not special forces of any kind. They were enginemen and torpedo men and signal men and a ship's cook. One of them had worked on a railroad before the war. Another had been a Boy Scout. That was the extent of their qualification for what they were about to do. And every single man aboard the Barb volunteered. What happened in the early hours of July 23, 1945, on that frozen coastline, is one of the most extraordinary small unit actions of the Second World War. 8 men went ashore. They carried a 55-pound demolition charge built from a submarine scuttling device, wired to batteries stuffed inside an empty pickle can, rigged to a micro-switch that an enlisted sailor had designed based on something he used to do with walnuts as a boy. They planted it under the rail. They ran, and a 16-car train, carrying 12 freight cars, 2 passenger cars, and 1 mail car, rolled over the switch at approximately 01:47 hours and blew itself apart. The locomotive wreckage flew 200 feet into the air. The cars behind it folded into a wall of twisted steel, and 8 American sailors, paddling rubber boats through the dark toward a submarine that was waiting with less than 6 feet of water beneath its keel, heard the explosion behind them and kept paddling. No submarine had ever destroyed a train. No American ground force had ever set foot on the Japanese home islands for a combat operation. Both of those things happened on the same night, carried out by the same 8 men, from the same submarine, under the command of a man who had already earned the Medal of Honor for doing something else that submarines were not supposed to do. This is the story of how a submarine sank a train. But more than that, it is the story of the captain who built a crew so willing to follow him that when he asked for 8 volunteers to paddle onto the shores of Japan, he had to turn away more than 70 men who wanted to go. And the reason they wanted to go, the thing that made the crew of the Barb different from every other submarine crew in the Pacific, had nothing to do with courage. Courage was common in the submarine service. Every man who climbed down the hatch of a fleet boat in 1944 knew the odds. The submarine service had the highest casualty rate of any branch of the United States military. Roughly 1 in 5 boats that went on patrol never came home. What made the Barb different was something else entirely. something her crew talked about after the war in reunions and interviews and letters, something that showed up in the way the boat fought and the way her captain gave orders. The Barb was different because her captain had done something that submarine commanders were not supposed to do. He had given the boat to its crew. That phrase, "he gave the boat to his crew," is the key to everything that follows, because it explains not just how 8 sailors ended up planting a bomb on a Japanese railroad in the middle of the night. It explains how the Barb became one of the most successful submarines in the United States Navy, credited with sinking more enemy tonnage than almost any other American boat in the war. It explains how a single boat sank more enemy tonnage on one patrol than almost any other American submarine. And it explains something that no statistic can capture, something that Eugene Fluckey considered the proudest achievement of his entire career, more important than the Medal of Honor, more important than the 4 Navy Crosses, more important than the 17 ships and 96,000 tons of enemy shipping his boat sent to the bottom of the Pacific. Not a single man aboard the Barb was ever killed or wounded. In 12 war patrols, across the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific, the Barb never earned a single Purple Heart. And Fluckey, who could have framed his Medal of Honor citation as the measure of his command, said after the war that bringing every man home was the only achievement that mattered. If this story moves you, a like helps it reach others who care about this history. If you are new here, subscribe. There is more to come. To understand what the Barb did on that night in Karafuto, you need to understand what the Japanese were seeing in the summer of 1945, because what they were seeing made no sense. In the final months of the war, Japanese intelligence on Karafuto and Hokkaido began receiving reports of attacks that defied explanation. Shore installations were being hit by rockets, but no aircraft had been spotted, and no carrier group was operating in the Sea of Okhotsk. A coastal defense vessel was sunk in waters that were supposed to be safe. Towns along the Karafuto coastline, Shari on Hokkaido, Shikuka and Kashiho on Karafuto, were being bombarded by what appeared to be naval gunfire, but no surface fleet was anywhere near the area. And then, on the morning of July 23, a train on the Karafuto East Line was found destroyed. The locomotive had been blown apart from below. The track was torn open. There were no bomb craters of the kind left by aircraft. There was no evidence of a naval bombardment. The damage had come from underneath the rails, as if the earth itself had detonated beneath the train. The Japanese response was confusion wrapped in propaganda. Tokyo Rose, the English-language propaganda broadcaster, mentioned the attacks along the northern coast. Japanese intelligence published a diagram that attempted to explain the pattern of strikes by splitting Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet into 2 groups, one operating against Honshu and one operating against the northern islands. The diagram was completely wrong. Halsey's fleet was nowhere near Karafuto. The strikes against Honshu were real, carried out by carrier aircraft. But every attack on the northern coast, every rocket barrage, every shore bombardment, every sinking, and the destruction of the train had been carried out by one vessel, one submarine, the Barb. The Japanese never identified the Barb by name during the war. They never understood that a single submarine was responsible for the entire pattern of destruction along their northern coastline, and they certainly never imagined that the train, a target that belonged to the world of land warfare, had been destroyed by sailors who paddled ashore in small boats, planted a charge, and paddled back. Japanese language histories of the Karafuto campaign recorded only that a small number of sailors from an American submarine secretly landed and blew up the track of the coastal railway. That was all they knew. The full story of what happened that night, and the kind of crew that made it possible, was something the Japanese would not learn until long after the war was over. The answer to how this happened, how a submarine became a raiding ship, how sailors became saboteurs, how a captain persuaded his entire crew to follow him into operations that no submarine manual had ever described, has layers. The surface answer is tactical. A creative commander saw an opportunity and seized it. But below the tactics is a philosophy of command that Eugene Fluckey had been building since the day he took over the Barb in the spring of 1944. a philosophy that contradicted almost everything the Navy taught about how a submarine captain was supposed to lead. And below that philosophy is a single decision Fluckey made about how to treat his crew. A decision so simple it sounds obvious when you hear it, but so rare in practice that it produced a submarine unlike any other in the fleet. That story starts not in Karafuto, not in the Pacific, not even on a submarine. It starts in Washington, D.C., in the childhood of a man whose scouting background would shape one of the most unusual combat missions of the war, and who would become the most unconventional submarine commander the United States Navy has ever known. Eugene Bennett Fluckey was born on October 5, 1913, in Washington, D.C. He was small, sharp, and relentlessly competitive in the way that boys who finish high school at 15 tend to be. He graduated from Western High School, attended Mercersburg Academy and Columbian Preparatory School, and entered the United States Naval Academy, graduating with the class of 1935. He was an Eagle Scout in the Boy Scouts of America, a distinction he carried with quiet pride for the rest of his life, and one that would play a direct and unexpected role in the train raid. His early Navy career was conventional for a man of his generation. He served on the battleship Nevada and the destroyer McCormick before requesting transfer to the submarine service, which in the years before the war was considered a specialty for ambitious officers willing to accept discomfort and danger in exchange for the independence of commanding their own vessel. Fluckey completed submarine school and served aboard the S-42 and the Bonita, older boats from an earlier era of submarine design, making 5 war patrols in the early years of the Pacific War before being assigned to the boat that would define his career. The Barb was a Gatto-class fleet submarine, built by the Electric Boat Company at Groton, Connecticut. Her keel was laid on June 7, 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor. She was launched on April 2, 1942, sponsored by the wife of Rear Admiral Charles Dunn, and commissioned on July 8 of that year under the command of Lieutenant Commander John Waterman. By the time Fluckey got her, the Barb was not new. She had completed 7 war patrols under previous commanding officers, 5 in the Atlantic and Mediterranean, including supporting Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa in November of 1942, and 2 in the Pacific. She was competent, experienced, and entirely unremarkable. Nothing in her record suggested what she was about to become. To serve on a fleet submarine in the Pacific in 1944 was to live inside a calculation about death. The boat was 311 feet of steel, powered by diesel engines on the surface and electric batteries below, carrying 24 torpedoes and a crew of roughly 80 men who slept in bunks stacked 3 high above the torpedo storage racks. The air inside smelled of diesel oil, sweat, and the particular staleness that comes from recycling the same oxygen through the same machine for weeks at a time. When the boat dived, the hull groaned under the water pressure. When depth charges fell nearby, the lights flickered, cork insulation cracked off the bulkheads, and every man aboard listened to the explosions and counted the seconds between them, knowing that if the interval got shorter, the next one might be close enough to crack the pressure hull and end everything. The men who volunteered for this did not talk about bravery. They talked about the boat. Was the boat sound? Were the welds good? Did the captain know what he was doing? That last question mattered more than anything else, because on a submarine, the captain's judgment was the only thing between 80 men and the bottom of the ocean. Fluckey took command in April of 1944 for the Barb's 8th Patrol. He was 30 years old, and within weeks, the crew understood that something fundamental had changed aboard their boat. The change was not tactical, not at first. It was cultural. Previous submarine captains ran their boats in the traditional Navy manner, and for good reason. A submarine is not a democracy. Decisions in combat must be made in seconds by one man, and the crew must execute without hesitation, or everyone dies. The captain decided. The officers planned. The crew executed. Information flowed downward. Decisions came from the top. This was not unique to the submarine service. It was how navies had operated for centuries, and it worked. The captain was the absolute authority aboard his ship, and the crew were his instruments. Fluckey did not reject that authority. He was too smart for that. He understood that in the split second between hearing a depth charge and ordering a crash dive, there was room for only one voice, and it had better be his. But he also understood something that most submarine captains of his era did not. The moments when the captain alone must decide are rare. They last seconds, sometimes minutes. The hours between those moments, the hours of planning, of preparation, of studying the enemy and the terrain and the odds, those hours belong to everyone. And so Fluckey did something that his crew noticed immediately. He asked questions. He asked the torpedo men what they thought about a firing solution. He asked the engine men whether the diesels could sustain a high-speed surface run in heavy seas. He asked the lookouts what they had seen on the horizon and what they thought it meant. He asked the cook whether the crew's morale had changed after the last engagement. He asked these questions not as a formality, not as a management technique he had read about in a leadership manual. He asked them because he wanted to know the answers. And when an enlisted man offered an idea that was better than the one on the wardroom table, Fluckey used it. He did not translate it into officer language. He did not present it as his own. He used it, credited the man who offered it, and moved on. In the United States Navy in 1944, this was unusual. A submarine captain who solicited tactical opinions from his enlisted crew was not violating regulations, but he was violating an unwritten understanding that ran deep in the service. Officers were trained to think. Enlisted men were trained to execute. The distance between the two was not a matter of regulation, it was a matter of identity. Fluckey blurred that identity so thoroughly that by the end of his first patrol in command, the Barb operated less like a conventional warship and more like a single organism, where every man understood not just what he was doing, but why he was doing it, and felt entitled to suggest a better way. The results were immediate and, to the rest of the submarine force, bewildering. Other submarine captains produced results through force of will, through brilliance at the periscope, through the sheer nerve of pressing a surface attack in the dark, with 80 men's lives hanging on their judgment. Fluckey produced results through something harder to define and harder to copy. His crew anticipated. When Fluckey raised the periscope and began describing what he saw, the fire control team already had a solution forming before he gave the order. When he called for a speed change or a course correction, the enginemen and helmsmen responded as though they had been expecting it, because in many cases they had. They knew the captain's habits, they knew his tactical instincts, and they knew these things not because they had memorized his patterns, but because he had explained his thinking to them over and over, patrol after patrol, until the way the captain thought had become the way the crew thought. On the Barb's 8th patrol under Fluckey, in the South China Sea in the fall of 1944, the boat sank a string of Japanese merchant vessels with an aggression that startled even the veteran crews who had been running Pacific patrols since 1942. Fluckey pressed attacks in shallow water, on the surface, at night, in conditions where most captains would have broken off and waited for a safer opportunity. He took the boat into harbors where charts showed depths that barely cleared the keel. He fired torpedoes at ranges so close that the weapons sometimes had trouble arming before impact. And he did this not with a silent, grimacing crew bracing for the worst, but with a crew that had helped plan the approach, understood the reasoning behind the risk, and executed with the confidence of men who owned their boat's decisions. The 9th patrol was the most productive yet. In September of 1944, the Barb sank the Japanese escort carrier Unyo, one of the most significant submarine kills of the entire Pacific War. The 10th patrol was worse still for the enemy. By the time the Barb left on her 11th patrol in January of 1945, Fluckey had developed a reputation in the submarine force as either the bravest or the most reckless captain in the fleet, depending on who you asked. The 11th patrol settled the question. On a January night in 1945, Fluckey took the Barb into Namkwan Harbor on the coast of China. Namkwan was not open water. It was a harbor, ringed by shoals, protected by shore batteries, filled with anchored enemy shipping. Taking a submarine into a defended harbor at night was the kind of action that operational textbooks described as suicidal. Fluckey did it because his crew had identified a concentration of Japanese ships inside, and he wanted to sink them. He did. The Barb torpedoed enemy shipping inside the harbor, scoring multiple hits. One of the vessels, an ammunition ship, detonated with such violence that the explosion damaged other vessels around it. The blast was visible for miles. Fluckey extracted the Barb through the shoals in the dark, navigating by the glow of burning ships behind him. For this action, he received the Medal of Honor. The citation praised his extraordinary courage, his willingness to penetrate a heavily defended anchorage, and the skill with which he brought his boat and crew out safely. But the detail that mattered most to the men aboard was the one the citation did not mention. Everyone came home. No casualties, no wounded. Not on the 11th patrol, not on the 10th, not on any patrol Fluckey commanded. The captain who took the most audacious risks in the submarine fleet had never lost a man. The crew understood why. The risks were bold, but they were not blind. Every attack was built on a foundation of preparation that the crew themselves had helped design. A man fights differently when the plan includes his own thinking. He fights with ownership, and the crew of the Barb owned their boat in a way that no Navy regulation had anticipated, and no other submarine in the fleet could quite replicate. By the spring of 1945, the Barb had been credited by the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee with sinking 17 enemy vessels, totaling 96,628 tons. Fluckey had earned the Medal of Honor and 3 Navy Crosses. The boat had received the Presidential Unit Citation, and Fluckey, whose tour as commanding officer should have ended after 4 patrols, personally negotiated with Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, the commander of the Pacific Submarine Force, for permission to take the Barb out one more time. Lockwood agreed. The 12th patrol would be the Barb's last, and it would be unlike anything the submarine service had ever seen. By the summer of 1945, the American submarine campaign against Japan had achieved something that no naval blockade in history had accomplished on this scale. The Japanese merchant marine was effectively destroyed. American submarines had sunk nearly 5 million tons of merchant shipping and over 500,000 tons of naval vessels during the war. The island nation that depended on imported oil, imported steel, imported food, and imported rubber had been severed from all of it. Japanese factories were shutting down for lack of raw materials. Japanese cities had already been burned to ruin by firebombing campaigns. But the very success of the submarine campaign created a problem for the captains still at sea. There was almost nothing left to sink. The great convoys that had once carried oil from the Dutch East Indies and rice from Southeast Asia no longer sailed. The harbors that had once sheltered enemy warships were empty or wrecked. Submarines that had spent 1943 and 44 running through target-rich waters now patrolled for days without seeing a single ship worth a torpedo. Fluckey was not the type of man to patrol empty water. When the Barb sailed from Midway on June 8, 1945, for her 12th and final patrol, she was heading north into the Sea of Okhotsk, around the top of Hokkaido, and along the coast of Karafuto. It was one of the last hunting grounds left, and even there the targets were small. Coastal freighters, fishing trawlers, supply barges. But Fluckey had come prepared to fight in ways that did not require torpedoes. During the Barb's overhaul at Mare Island Naval Shipyard before the patrol, he had requisitioned something no submarine captain had ever requested: an experimental 5-inch rocket launcher. The launcher was bolted to the deck, a jury-rigged contraption that transformed a submarine into a surface bombardment vessel. No submarine in the United States Navy had ever fired rockets in combat. The Barb was about to become the first and the only one to do so in the entire war. And she did. On the 12th patrol, the Barb bombarded Japanese shore installations on Karafuto and Hokkaido with rockets and deck gun fire, destroying supply depots, fuel stores, and coastal infrastructure. She hit the town of Shari on Hokkaido. She rocketed Shikuka and Kashiho on the Karafuto coast. She bombarded Kaihyo Island on July 2. She sank a Japanese coastal defense vessel with her last 5 torpedoes on July 18. She turned a submarine into a one-boat raiding fleet, striking targets that no submarine was designed to strike, in waters so shallow that her crew could sometimes see the bottom through the clear northern water. And then, on July 19, Fluckey raised the periscope in Patience Bay and saw the trains. They were moving along the Karafuto East Line, a single-track railway that hugged the coastline near Otasamu. Fluckey watched them for 3 days. He counted the cars. He noted the intervals. He studied the terrain between the tracks and the waterline, measuring with his eye the distance a man would have to cover on foot to reach the rails from a beach landing. And somewhere in those 3 days, the idea took its final shape. The Barb had no torpedoes left. She had expended most of her rockets. Her deck gun could not reach the tracks from a safe distance offshore. But she had men, and she had something else. A standard scuttling charge, a piece of submarine equipment designed to be detonated inside the boat if she had to be destroyed to prevent capture. Every submarine carried them. No one had ever considered using one offensively, on land, against a target that belonged to an entirely different kind of war. What happened next is the part that reveals what kind of boat the Barb really was, because the plan to destroy the train did not come from the captain. Chief Gunner's mate Paul Saunders, the Barb's chief of the boat, was the man who first suggested the idea of a submarine sinking a train. Saunders was a plank owner, one of the original crew members who had been aboard since the Barb was commissioned in July of 1942. He had made all 12 of her war patrols, a record almost unheard of in the submarine service where crews rotated regularly and the stress of repeated combat patrols ground men down. He was the most senior enlisted man aboard, the bridge between the officers and the crew, and the man Fluckey trusted more than anyone else on the boat. When Saunders suggested that the Barb could add a train to her battle flag, the idea landed on a captain who had spent his entire command encouraging exactly this kind of thinking from below. But the idea had a problem. How do you detonate a charge at the exact moment a train passes over it? A timed fuse was too unpredictable. No one could know exactly when a train would arrive. A man hiding by the tracks with a manual detonator was too dangerous, both to the man and to the mission. If the saboteur was spotted, the entire shore party would be trapped on a hostile island, with no extraction plan except a 130-mile walk north to Soviet territory through frozen mountains. The charge had to go off automatically. It had to be triggered by the train itself. The solution came from a sailor named Billy Hatfield, an electrician's mate 3rd class who had worked on a railroad before the Navy. Hatfield remembered something from his childhood. As a boy, he used to crack walnuts by placing them between the railroad ties beneath the rail. When a train passed over, the weight of the locomotive pressing down on the rail would sag it just enough to crush the nut against the tie. The same principle, Hatfield realized, could trigger a bomb. If they placed a micro switch underneath the rail, connected to a battery circuit wired to the scuttling charge, the weight of the locomotive would depress the switch and close the circuit. The train would detonate the bomb by running over it. No timer, no man with a detonator. No one had to be anywhere near the tracks when the train arrived. Fluckey approved the plan immediately. The Barb's engineers went to work. They wired the scuttling charge to 3 dry cell batteries, packed the assembly into an empty pickle can, and rigged the switch to a wooden wedge designed to fit snugly beneath the base of the rail. They cut up steel deck plates from the submarine to fashion an improvised pick and shovel for digging under the tracks. They assembled the entire apparatus from materials already aboard the boat. No special equipment was requested from Fleet Command. No demolition experts were consulted. A submarine crew, working with pickle cans, deck plates, batteries, and ingenuity, built a weapon that had never existed before. Then came the question of who would carry that weapon ashore. Fluckey wanted to lead the party himself. His officers stopped him. They told him flatly that they would break radio silence and signal Vice Admiral Lockwood at Pacific Submarine Command if the captain attempted to go ashore. A submarine captain walking onto a Japanese beach was a risk the crew refused to accept, no matter how much Fluckey wanted to be there. He relented. The shore party would be led by Lieutenant William Walker, the only commissioned officer in the group. Every man aboard volunteered, all of them, the roughly 80 men on the boat, every department, every rank, every watch section. When Fluckey posted the call for volunteers, he did not receive a list of 8 names. He received a list of every name on the boat. A Japanese prisoner of war who had been picked up earlier in the patrol also offered to go. His offer was declined, but he provided useful information about Japanese beach patrols along the Karafuto coast. Fluckey set his selection criteria, and the criteria themselves tell you something about the man. Volunteers had to be unmarried, with one exception. The party had to include a mix of regular Navy and Navy Reserve sailors. Every department aboard the boat had to be represented, so that if the worst happened and the shore party was lost, no single department would be gutted, and at least half the men had to be former Boy Scouts. That last requirement sounds eccentric until you understand Fluckey. He was an Eagle Scout himself, and he believed that men with scouting experience knew how to navigate unfamiliar terrain in the dark, how to move quietly through brush, and how to handle unexpected problems without losing their composure. It was not commando training, it was something more fundamental. It was the kind of self-reliance that a boy learns sleeping under the stars and carries into every difficult situation for the rest of his life. The 8 men selected were Lieutenant Walker as party leader, Chief Gunner's mate Paul Saunders, the chief of the boat, who was not going to let anyone else lead his idea to the beach, Electrician's mate 3rd Class Billy Hatfield, the railroad man who had designed the detonation system, Signalman 2nd Class Francis Sever, Ship's Cook 1st Class Lawrence Newland, Torpedoman's mate 3rd Class Edward Klingersmith, Motor Machinist's mate 2nd Class James Richard, and Motor Machinist's mate 1st Class John Markison. They rehearsed bird whistle signals for communication on the beach. They packed pistols, flashlights, and enough survival gear to make it to Soviet territory, 130 miles to the north, through mountain ranges, in case they could not get back to the boat. And they brought stakes. The stakes were for guard dogs. They waited 4 days for the weather. The plan required cloud cover thick enough to obscure a 3/4 moon that would otherwise have silhouetted them against the water. On the night of July 22, the clouds rolled in over Patience Bay. Fluckey eased the Barb toward the coast, 950 yards from shore. The fathometer showed 12 feet of water beneath the keel. A Gato-class submarine draws just over 15 feet. The Barb was operating in water so shallow that the difference between floating and grounding was measured in inches. If a swell pushed the boat down, if the tide shifted, if the charts were off by a single fathom, the Barb would be stuck on the bottom within sight of the Japanese coast, unable to dive, unable to maneuver, and visible to any patrol vessel that rounded the headland. Fluckey held the position. Shortly after midnight on July 23, 2 rubber boats were lowered into the dark water. The boats had been fitted with small improvised radar reflectors so the Barb could track them on the return trip. Fluckey spoke to the men before they shoved off. His words, as he recorded them in his memoir, were plain. "Boys, if you get stuck, head for Siberia. 130 miles north, following the mountain ranges. Good luck." The boats pushed off into the dark. It took roughly 25 minutes to reach the beach. 25 minutes of paddling in silence through water that was cold enough to kill a man in minutes if he fell in. The men could hear the surf breaking on the shore ahead of them, and behind them, the low, dark shape of the Barb was already fading into the night. They were, for these minutes, as alone as any American servicemen had been in the entire war. Behind them was a submarine that could not dive in water this shallow. Ahead of them was the home territory of an empire that had been fighting for 4 years and had never once had enemy soldiers set foot on its soil. If they were discovered, there would be no rescue, there would be no air support, there would be no naval gunfire, there would be 8 men with pistols against a garrison. The landing site was disturbingly close to civilization. The shore party could see a Japanese house barely 50 yards away. There were footprints in the sand and dog tracks. 2 men were posted to guard the boats. The remaining 6, led by Walker, moved inland through waist-high grass, crossed a coastal highway, and pushed toward the railroad tracks roughly 400 yards from the waterline. Walker fell headfirst into drainage ditches on both sides of the road in the dark, picking himself up without a sound each time. No one spoke. Communication was by hand signal and bird whistle. 3 men took up sentry positions around the worksite. John Markison, assigned to watch the perimeter, climbed what he believed was a good observation point and discovered too late that it was an occupied Japanese watchtower. The sentry inside was asleep. Markison backed down the structure step by careful step and reported what he had found. The party continued. The others began preparing the charge. The improvised pick and shovel they had built aboard the submarine were set aside almost immediately because the noise of metal scraping gravel carried too far in the still night air. They dug with their hands. While they were digging, something happened that nearly ended the mission. A blacked-out train appeared on the tracks without warning, moving fast, bearing down on the worksite from the south. The shore party scrambled into the brush on either side of the rail bed. Billy Hatfield, lying flat beside the tracks, was close enough to see the face of the engineer in the locomotive cab as the train thundered past. As the wheels roared over him, barely yards away, Hatfield felt 2 sharp impacts against his chest. He believed for a terrible instant that he had been shot. He had not. The carbon dioxide cartridges in his inflatable life vest had fired spontaneously, triggered by the vibration of the train passing so close to where he lay. The train rolled on and vanished to the south. The shore party climbed back to the tracks and resumed digging. They buried the scuttling charge between the ties and positioned the trigger on its wooden wedge underneath the rail. This was the most dangerous phase of the operation. Once Hatfield connected the wires, the circuit was live and the switch was armed. Any train, at any second, could set it off. Fluckey's plan called for the shore party to withdraw to the boats, while Hatfield made the final connection alone, so that only one man would be at risk during the last and most vulnerable step. The rest of the party refused the order. They stayed, all of them, standing over Hatfield's shoulder in the dark as he carefully positioned the switch beneath the rail, unwilling to leave their shipmate alone, with a live bomb at his feet. They even insisted that Hatfield move the switch closer to the rail to guarantee the weight of the locomotive would trigger it. Hatfield complied. Then they ran. The party signaled departure at approximately 0132. Fluckey, watching from the bridge of the Barb, had already moved the submarine even closer to shore, cutting the distance to roughly 600 yards, with barely 6 feet of water beneath the keel. If something went wrong, if the party was discovered, if a Japanese patrol boat appeared, the Barb would have no room to dive and no time to retreat. Fluckey had placed his submarine and his entire crew in a position of maximum vulnerability so that 8 of them would have the shortest possible paddle home. The boats were halfway back to the submarine when the Barb's lookout spotted movement on the tracks. A second train, northbound, rolling along the coastal tracks directly toward the buried charge. Fluckey called out across the dark water, his voice carrying to the men in the boats, "Paddle like the devil." They paddled. Behind them, the northbound train rolled forward. Its locomotive passed over the micro-switch that Billy Hatfield had wedged beneath the rail. At approximately 0147 hours, on July 23, 1945, the charge detonated. The boilers of the locomotive blew apart. Wreckage flew 200 feet into the air, racing ahead of a mushroom of smoke that shifted from white to black as the fuel ignited. 16 cars, 12 freight, 2 passenger, and 1 mail car piled into the wall of wreckage ahead of them, folding and rolling off the tracks in a twisting mass of steel that burned against the dark Karafuto sky. The men in the boats watched the explosion over their shoulders. They kept paddling. By approximately 0152, 5 minutes after the detonation, all 8 men were back aboard the Barb. Not one had been injured. Not one had been detected. Not one had fired a weapon. The first and last American ground assault on the Japanese home islands had lasted less than 2 hours from launch to recovery and had been carried out by 8 sailors whose most advanced piece of demolition equipment was a scuttling charge wired to batteries inside a tin can. Fluckey then did something that tells you everything about the kind of captain he was. He allowed every off-duty crew member to come topside and look at the burning wreckage on the shore. He wanted all of his men to see what their boat had accomplished. Not just the 8 who went ashore, but all of them. Because in Fluckey's mind, the train did not belong to the shore party, it belonged to the crew. Then he ordered the Barb to slip away at 2 knots, creeping through the shallow water toward the open sea, toward deeper water, toward safety. The Barb continued her 12th patrol for 3 more days, bombarding Japanese positions along the Karafuto coast through July 26. She concluded the patrol at Midway on August 2, 1945. 4 days later, on August 6, the first atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. 3 days after that, Nagasaki. On August 15, Japan announced its surrender. The war was over. The train raid had been carried out less than 3 weeks before the end. The men who paddled ashore on that beach were among the last American servicemen to conduct an offensive ground operation against the Empire. What they did remained, then and now, the only ground combat action carried out by American forces on the Japanese home islands during the war. No other submarine attempted anything like it. No other submarine crew was asked to, and no submarine of any navy in any war before or since has been credited with the destruction of a train. Submarines had landed men on hostile shores before. In August of 1942, the submarines Nautilus and Argonaut had carried marine raiders to Makin Atoll in the Gilbert Islands for a hit-and-run raid on the Japanese garrison. But Makin was a coral atoll in the Central Pacific, not part of the Japanese home islands. The Barb herself had put a 5-man team of United States Army Rangers ashore on the North African coast during Operation Torch in November of 1942, years before Fluckey took command. But that had been a scouting and beacon operation for an Allied invasion force that was already offshore, and the men who went ashore were soldiers, not submariners. What the Barb did on Karafuto was categorically different. 8 men went onto the home territory of the enemy empire, conducted a demolition operation against a land target using improvised weapons, and returned to their submarine without being detected. No plan existed for this. No doctrine covered it. No one in the chain of command above Fluckey had ordered it or even imagined it. It was conceived aboard the Barb, planned aboard the Barb, equipped with materials found aboard the Barb, and executed by men who had never been trained for anything like it. The mission existed because the boat had a captain who asked his crew what they thought, and a crew that thought they could do anything. That distinction, the sheer improbability of it, is what draws people to the story. A submarine sinking a train has the quality of a tall tale, the kind of thing a sailor might invent over drinks at a portside bar. But the deeper story, the one that explains why this particular submarine did this particular thing while no other boat in the fleet even considered it, is not about novelty or audacity, it is about command. Consider what Fluckey had built aboard the Barb by the summer of 1945. The idea to sink the train came from his chief of the boat, an enlisted man. The detonation system came from an electrician's mate 3rd class, who remembered a trick he learned as a boy on the railroad tracks near his home. The improvised tools were fabricated by the engineering department from scrap materials without being asked. The selection criteria came from the captain's own Boy Scout experience. The party was led by a lieutenant because the crew physically prevented the captain from going himself. And the men who went ashore were not specialists. They were submariners, enginemen, and cooks and signalmen who believed they could walk onto a Japanese beach and blow up a train because their captain had spent 5 patrols teaching them that every man on the boat mattered and every idea from every rank deserved to be heard. In most submarines of that era, the captain made the decisions and the crew carried them out. In the Barb, the crew brought the ideas and the captain decided which ones to act on. The difference sounds small. It was not. It was the difference between a crew that followed orders and a crew that owned the mission. And a crew that owns the mission will volunteer for things that a crew merely following orders would never consider. Remember that phrase from earlier? He gave the boat to his crew. This is what it looked like. A captain who listened to a chief's suggestion about sinking a train. A captain who adopted an enlisted man's childhood memory as a demolition plan. A captain who let his officers overrule him when they said he could not go ashore. A captain who, after the explosion, brought every man topside to see the wreckage, because the wreckage belonged to all of them. One detail about the train deserves mention, because it has been distorted in popular retellings of the raid. The official record from the Naval History and Heritage Command describes the wrecked train as consisting of a locomotive, 12 freight cars, 2 passenger cars, and 1 mail car. Some secondary accounts have claimed that 150 passengers were killed. That number does not appear in the official Navy record. It does not appear in the War Patrol report, and it does not appear in any verified Japanese source. The Navy's own historians have noted that Japanese propaganda alleged civilian casualties, while American intelligence indicated that trains traveling at night on Karafuto carried troops, not civilian passengers. No independent Japanese casualty record for this incident has ever been located. The honest answer is that the exact toll is unknown and may never be established with certainty. What is known with certainty is what happened afterward, to the men and to the boat they served on. The 8 men of the shore party each received the Silver Star. Fluckey received his 4th Navy Cross, with a citation that specifically referenced the landing of a commando party in rubber boats on a hostile shore and their success in destroying a Japanese train. Across the crew, the Barb earned a Medal of Honor, 6 Navy Crosses, 23 Silver Stars, and 23 Bronze Stars over the course of her war. She never earned a Purple Heart, not one. In 12 patrols, no man aboard the Barb was killed or wounded. It is one of the most remarkable safety records in the history of combat submarines. The Barb's battle flag, hand-sewn by the crew and updated after each patrol, was brought ashore at Pearl Harbor in August of 1945. Across its surface were the symbols of the Barb's wartime record: rising sun emblems for warships sunk, merchant silhouettes for freighters sent to the bottom, and at the bottom center, in a position no submarine battle flag had ever included before or has included since, there was a locomotive. The photograph of the 8 shore party members standing with that flag, taken at Pearl Harbor after the final patrol, is held by the Naval History and Heritage Command. The flag itself is on permanent display at the Submarine Force Library and Museum in Groton, Connecticut, the same city where the Barb's keel was laid in 1941. Eugene Fluckey went home from the war to a career that matched the range of his wartime command. He served in the office of the Secretary of the Navy under James Forrestal. He was aide to Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz when Nimitz served as Chief of Naval Operations. He was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1960. He commanded the Submarine Force Pacific from 1964 to 1966. He served as Director of Naval Intelligence. He led the Military Assistance Advisory Group in Portugal before retiring from the Navy in 1972 after 37 years of active service. And then he did something that no one who knew him only as a warrior would have predicted. He and his wife Marjorie opened an orphanage in Portugal. For 8 years, from 1974 to 1982, the man who had sunk 17 ships and destroyed a train and earned the Medal of Honor spent his days caring for children who had no one else. He never spoke about this as though it required justification. It was simply what came next. A man who had spent 5 patrols protecting his crew now spent 8 years protecting children. Paul Saunders, the chief of the boat, the plank owner who had made all 12 patrols and first suggested the idea of sinking a train, served 26 years in the United States Navy. After the war, he helped develop launch systems for the Loon missile, the Regulus missile, and the Polaris ballistic missile, the weapons that transformed the submarine service from a torpedo fleet into the backbone of America's nuclear deterrent. He retired as a chief gunner's mate in 1962. The Naval Submarine League named an award for outstanding chief petty officers in his honor. He had been twice awarded the Silver Star over the course of his career. James Richard, the motor machinist's mate, who paddled ashore on that July night, stayed in the Navy after the war and rose to the rank of commander. He gave interviews about the raid in the decades that followed, ensuring that the story was not forgotten. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Billy Hatfield, the man who cracked walnuts on the railroad as a boy and built a detonation system from pickle cans and dry cell batteries aboard a submarine in the Sea of Okhotsk, went home after the war. The details of his later life are sparse in the public record, but his idea, the micro switch under the rail, the device that let a 16-car train destroy itself, is the detail that every account of the raid returns to, because it captures something essential about what the Barb was under Eugene Fluckey. It was a boat where a junior enlisted man's childhood memory could become a weapon of war, because the captain had built a culture where memories and ideas and suggestions from any rank were worth hearing. Fluckey published his memoir, Thunder Below, in 1992. The book won the Samuel Eliot Morison Award for Naval Literature. He used the proceeds to fund reunions for the men who had served under him, because Fluckey believed that the book, like the boat, belonged to its crew. He died on June 28, 2007, at the age of 93. He is buried at the United States Naval Academy Cemetery in Annapolis, Maryland. In 2020, the United States Navy announced that a future Virginia-class attack submarine, hull number SSN 804, will carry the name USS Barb. When that boat enters service, she will bear the name of a submarine whose crew sank ships, fired rockets, bombarded enemy towns, and paddled ashore to blow up a train. She will carry the name of a boat that did things no other submarine in history has done. But more than any weapon or any tactic, she will carry the legacy of a captain who understood something about leadership that cannot be found in any manual or taught at any academy. The submarine service lost 52 boats and 3,506 men during the Second World War. 1 in 5 submarines that went on war patrol did not come home. Fluckey took the Barb into minefields, harbors, shallow coastal waters, and onto the enemy's own shoreline, and brought back every man every time. He did not accomplish this by being cautious. He accomplished it by being prepared. And he was prepared because his crew prepared him, because the observations that saved lives came from every corner of the boat, from the torpedo room and the engine room and the galley and the signal bridge, from men who understood that their captain would listen and that their ideas could change the outcome. That is the answer to the question in this video's title. He sent a submarine crew ashore to wreck a train in Japan because he had built a crew capable of doing things that submarine crews were never meant to do. He had built them not by training them harder or drilling them longer, but by doing the simplest and rarest thing a commanding officer can do. He trusted them, and they trusted him back. The locomotive on the Barb's battle flag, stitched at the bottom center below the warships and the merchant vessels and the carrier, is the proof. Not proof that a submarine can destroy a train. Any explosive can destroy a train if the geometry is right. That locomotive is proof that a crew of 80 men, sealed inside a steel tube beneath the Pacific, believed they could do anything their captain asked, because their captain believed they could do anything they suggested. When Paul Saunders proposed sinking a train, Fluckey listened. When Billy Hatfield remembered the walnuts, Fluckey listened. When the officers told the captain he could not go ashore, Fluckey listened. And when 80 men volunteered for 8 slots on a boat heading toward the shores of Japan, Fluckey understood that he had built something no regulation described and no manual anticipated. He had built a crew that wanted to follow him onto enemy soil, not because he ordered them to, but because he had spent 5 patrols proving that their judgment, their ingenuity, and their lives mattered to him as much as any mission. The Barb's record, 17 ships, 96,000 tons, a Medal of Honor, 4 Navy Crosses, 0 Purple Hearts, will stand as long as the Navy keeps its records. But the record cannot capture the sound of 2 rubber boats cutting through black water at midnight, or the weight of a pickle can full of explosives carried across a Japanese beach by a ship's cook, or the sight of a locomotive rising 200 feet into the sky over Karafuto on a July night in 1945. The 8 men who carried that charge are gone now. Their names survive in a Navy photograph and on a battle flag in a museum in Connecticut. What survives with them is the proof that leadership is not a rank or a regulation or a tradition handed down through generations of officers. Leadership is a choice. Eugene Fluckey chose to trust his crew. His crew chose to follow him onto a beach, and a train on the coast of Karafuto became the only train in history ever destroyed by a submarine, because one captain understood that the most powerful weapon aboard his boat was not a torpedo or a rocket or a 55-pound scuttling charge. It was the crew who built the plan, built the bomb, and walked it onto the enemy's shore. Thank you for spending these minutes with these men. If this story reached you, a like is the single best way to help it find others who care about this history. If you are not subscribed, now is a good time, and the bell ensures you never miss one of these. I would love to hear where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in the submarine service or on any ship during the Second World War, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the ones you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.